Well, welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, C2G's Director of Communications, and I'm speaking today with Saleemul Huq, who is the Director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. Professor Huq is an expert on the links between climate change and sustainable development, particularly from the perspective of developing countries, and leads the annual Gobeshona Conference, which brings together scholars, policymakers, researchers and practitioners from around the world to discuss climate change. Professor Huq was the lead author of the chapter on adaptation and sustainable development in the third assessment report of the IPCC, and was the lead author of the chapter on adaptation and mitigation in the fourth assessment report. His current focus is on supporting the engagement of the least developed countries in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome, Saleem, to C2G Talk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Well, maybe let's start with a broad question. How would you characterize the state of debate and action today to address climate change within broader efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, from where I'm sitting here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, climate change is perhaps the most important of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals in terms of SDG 13 being on climate change. But then Bangladesh is also a poor country, so all the other SDGs are also highly relevant. But I think even at the global level, climate change is by far the most important overarching part of the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't see any of them being achieved without tackling climate change as a sine qua non.
So do you see the sort of discussions about tackling climate change and how they relate to achieving the other Sustainable Development Goals? Do you see these discussions being held in a sufficiently joined up way, in a sort of a holistic manner?
Not yet, but we are beginning to get there. So in my view, the conversation and the paradigm needs to be shifted from climate change being one of 17, i.e. SDG 13, to being really an overarching framing of all the other 16. And that, to a large extent, is beginning to be understood. I would certainly say in my country, Bangladesh, it is understood. Climate change is really an overarching issue that now everything is subsumed within because we are such a vulnerable country. But I think globally, if you listen to Greta Thunberg, and I listen to her very carefully, I do believe that she has it right. We're in a global emergency. It's a crisis. And, this is the overarching framing. Everything else is subsidiary to tackling climate change.
In terms of what's going to happen this year on climate change, there's the COP26, which some are describing as a make or break meeting for increasing climate action. Some are questioning what exactly it's going to achieve. What would you expect to see come out of this year, and how important do you see this year's COP26?
Well, as COPs go, and I've had I don't know if it's the good fortune or the misfortune to having attended every single one of the last 25 COPs.
Wow.
I think I'm just a handful of people who's been able to do that. And so I know what COPs can and cannot do. So in the context of what COPs can do, I think COP26 is an extremely important COP, where countries do come together, they make decisions, they decide what to do. The last time we had such an important COP was in 2015 when we met in Paris, and we had the Paris Agreement come out of that. And so not every COP is extremely important. They vary in importance. COP26 is definitely an important COP. But I think, having said that, the climate change problem, in my view, has escaped the COPs. It's the reality of the atmosphere and the weather systems around the world. And that is not something the COPs have been able to manage to prevent or to tackle effectively. And so it's reality on the ground. And so, all I have to do is look out my window here in Dhaka, and people are being affected by climate change. And that doesn't matter what the COP does, says, agrees at all. Reality on the ground is overtaking the discussions at the global level. And so the reality of climate change and what are we going to do to deal with the reality is by far the far more important issue. And as I have said earlier, presidents and finance ministers are the ones, prime ministers, leaders, who have to take those decisions, not environment ministers anymore. The environment ministers are the ones who go to the COP and talk about it as an environmental issue. It has completely superseded being dealt with as purely environmental.
So in a way, you think that the situation has gone beyond the ability of COP as currently set up to tackle it. So what might you replace COP with, or how would you reform COP to be able to address that?
It's not a matter of replacing COP, it's a matter of implementing whatever we decide. So we've made a decision. We have a Paris Agreement. We've agreed what needs to be done. We need the temperature to be brought down to 1.5 degrees. We're just not doing it. And so the COP is just a place where we take stock and say, well, we haven't done this now. Should we do a little bit more, not do a little bit more, give up, whatever. These are just talk shops. The reality is what people do on the ground in their own countries. And that is really where the action is, and that where we need to be focusing our discussions. And that involves everybody. It involves civil society. It involves private sector. It involves companies. Every single company on the planet now has to figure out what is it going to do to tackle climate change. And if it doesn't figure that out, it's going to be wiped out by climate change.
So what do you see right now that is happening on that regard? What are the key trends that we could point to right now in terms of actual action on the ground?
Well, we are not doing enough. That's the starting point. We recognize that. But the opportunities and if glimmers of hope that I would point to going forward are, firstly, the change in government in the United States. So we had 4 years of Trump taking the whole world backwards. That was a huge, anchor weighing us down to move forward. That's removed. US is back in the Paris Agreement. We have very good promises from incoming President Biden, his climate envoy, and others in the administration talking about becoming leaders again on tackling climate change. We hope so. We look forward to that happening. Haven't seen it happen yet, but we hope it will happen. We take them at their word. And secondly, the other big push, in my view, is what young people are telling us. And I mentioned Greta Thunberg, and I do this quite seriously. You know, this one girl, she just decided she wanted to do something about it. And she took every Friday off school and sat outside the Swedish parliament with a placard, a homemade placard. And that has galvanized young people all over the world, including here in my country, Bangladesh. Young people are now up in arms, and they are telling their leaders, telling their parents and their grandparents, and that they have simply not done a good enough job, and they have to change. And that push, in my view, is what will make a big difference rather than the talk at the COPs. The COPs have become sort of routine places that people negotiate, government officials negotiate in extremely arcane language about things that nobody really understands.
Wow. So I wonder if I could turn to a couple of the challenges that we focus on here in C2G. In addition to the essential work of cutting emissions, the IPCC also says that large-scale carbon dioxide removal, removal of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere, is needed to achieve net zero and limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. How might the world go about governing carbon dioxide removal approaches, perhaps especially in light of their potential trade-offs and synergies with various sustainable development goals?
Well, this is something that I have, I would say, relatively recently started taking an interest in. So I don't claim to be an expert at all, but I'm a learner, and I hope to learn quickly. And as you mentioned, we have an annual conference we call Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research, which for the last couple of years, we've invited eminent international speakers to come and tell us about solar radiation management and other forms of geoengineering that are being discussed in order for us to learn about it, to know what it is that's being discussed, are the different things under those broad headings, what's the difference between the different ones, and particularly from the perspective of the vulnerable countries, particularly the least developed countries, which are a formal caucus group in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, whom I advise, what should be our stance on any given one of these potential solutions that are being touted as solutions. Every solution always also has some negative impacts associated with it, and we need to know about those before we grant them the privilege of being called genuine solutions. And from our point of view, the key element in anything that is being proposed is its governance. Who's making the decisions? And one of the biggest advantages of the COP is every single country, including the smallest, most vulnerable, has a seat at the table. There are almost 200 countries there. Every single country has a seat at the table. That makes it a democratic institution. Not every country has the same level of say in deciding everything, but they have a seat at the table. They have a voice. What we are very afraid of is decisions being taken where we are not invited. We are not at the table. And those decisions may have negative repercussions for us, which, if we're not at the table, we're not going to be able to either understand or influence. So having a say in decision making is an extremely important part from us.
So with specific reference to carbon dioxide removal, what level of awareness do you see in LDCs in least developed countries about that aspect of the climate change action that's needed? And do you see both challenges? You've identified some, but also opportunities in moving to carbon dioxide removal for the regions you work with?
Sure. So the most simple and easily understood form of carbon dioxide removal is planting trees. And we do a lot of that. All right. So that is a no-brainer. It's accepted. It's something that happens everywhere. Very, very popular with many, many different groups and people, civil society in particular, farmers, etc. So, tree planting as a carbon dioxide removing mechanism is by far our most preferred option. We do realize that may not be enough. And so we may need to look at other more technologically advanced means of taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, if necessary, by technology. And we believe that there are some technologies being developed. To my knowledge, none of them are in the developing world. They're all in the developed world. So we sort of are observers of the promotion or development of those technologies. And as I said, we like to learn. We keep our eyes and ears open. I've been listening to Mr. Bill Gates a lot recently. He's been touting his book. He gets, publicity at a level that are orders of magnitude of the vulnerable people. Every major global broadcaster is interested to interview him and hear his views, but not me, or not the vulnerable people on the planet who are being affected by impacts of climate change. So there's a hugely unlevel playing field in terms of whose voice counts at the global level, which we are aware of and we are very afraid of. Not that I disagree with him, but I do feel that, he gets a disproportionate platform to wield his views, which I may not agree with.
So, for example, on carbon dioxide removal, and we'll move on to some other approaches in a second, but what do you think are the perspectives that, let's say, in the media and others did listen to your advice and did give vulnerable people and people in the LDCs a bigger voice in this? What kind of perspectives would you see being brought to bear on this question? Are there any particular areas you think that are not being pushed in the right direction? Here's your chance. Here's a chance.
Sure. So I have I would say, relatively less informed view. I don't know all the nuances. I don't track this on a very close basis. But from what I do know, I have an impression that some of the more technologically advanced options that are being discussed are primarily the domain of billionaires, okay, like Bill Gates. These are billionaires who have billions of money to put into something, And they have decided on their own as individuals that this is a good thing. They're doing it with the best of intentions. I have no doubt about that. But a good thing for them is not necessarily a good thing for the rest of the world. Right? And so I'm afraid of Mr. Bill Gates making a decision that's going to have repercussions on me here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and my people in Bangladesh, which he may not even know of. He may know and care about it, or he may not know and he may not even care about it. So I have grave reservations of letting him make these decisions on his own. And at the moment, he seems to be. And when I say him, I'm just singling out one individual. There are a bunch of them. And so that to me is the most frightening aspect of decisions being made on behalf of the planet by individuals who feel they know what the planet needs, but don't necessarily know what the poorest people on the planet actually need. And they may be doing more harm than good.
So I'm going to introduce now a set of approaches that may cause even more concern. There's this ideas of reflecting more sunlight into space in order to reduce the risks of overshooting temperature goals. These might include brightening marine clouds or even spraying aerosols into the stratosphere to act as some sort of reflective shield, perhaps might be one way. You've raised a lot of the issues, I think, that would affect this in terms of governance. How would the world, in a more fair or just or equitable dispensation, consider the risks posed by these approaches against, of course, the expected risks of climate change?
Well, I would give you a generic answer for any technologically based solution for anything. It needs to be piloted at a pilot scale in order for its efficacy to be tested and its downside risks to be tested at the same time. It's like the vaccine that we are now seeing produced for COVID-19. All right. Producing the vaccine is hugely technological advance by our scientists. Great thing. But we have to be careful. Are they going to work? Are they going to have side effects? Are they good for the new variants? So there's a whole bunch of second order issues that are extremely important before we declare one of them the magical solution and everybody gets a jab with it. And so to me, the same caution applies to any kind of new technology, whether it's solar radiation management through different techniques, piloting on a small scale that doesn't cause a lot of damage, but we can then test. And then the decision to go forward should be done in a manner that takes everybody's views into account. And a global problem, we don't have a global government. The nearest thing we have is the United Nations. The United Nations Framework Convention is a treaty that all the countries have agreed to. To me, that's the forum in which the next phase of anything, a deployment of anything, needs to be discussed and agreed. That cannot be arbitrarily decided by a handful of individuals who have a lot of money.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. Perhaps maybe I would take the first question around piloting. So there is, one school of thought out there which would suggest that even discussing, let alone researching or at some point testing, and I'm not sure what the line is between some of these things, could cause a moral hazard, could lead people to take certain kind of policy decisions that they might not have if this wasn't seen as that potential option. Do you see that kind of risk, or do you think that there's a greater risk in effect in not learning about such approaches?
I myself am open-minded, and that's why I said, when I heard about these things, I didn't automatically say they're bad. I said I want to know more about them before I say they're bad. I might say they're bad, but before learning what they are and learning about the nuances, I don't want to say they're bad. And so what I would say in terms of testing, there is now the capacity, technological capacity to test anything on models without doing anything in the real world. And so model-based testing, I would say, is definitely an option that we need to look at. And if the models then tell us that something may have a beneficial effect, one moves to the next phase of that in terms of a very limited, confined test of seeing whether it works in reality, but on a very small scale, and to check that out. Once we've checked that out, then we know whether it works or not and what the downsides of it might be. And only then we need to think about scaling it up. So to me, the R&D part, the research in the terms of modeling something, that is a no-brainer, should definitely happen. This is where, human mind will come up with ideas that we'll test. Anything that is very promising, that is worth looking at in terms of examining it further, again, with a very strong oversight that can also possibly go forward. And then after that, we are in the realm of decision making that will have both pros and cons attached to them. And there is almost nothing that can be proposed to solve one problem that doesn't create a second order problem of its own. And to me, the desire to find a single bullet solution is one of those extremely dangerous desires, because single bullet solutions are actually scattergun solutions, and they hit a lot of other people that are unintended targets of the single bullet. The person thinks he's firing one bullet to kill one problem, but the bullets scatter and they hit other people who he did not intend to hit. And that is what we need to be careful about.
So you talked a bit about various fora which have universal or some kind of broader legitimacy. Do you think, you mentioned the UNFCCC, do you think that then for discussions about solar radiation modification, SRM or management, or do you think that we have the institutions that will allow this fair, equitable discussion? Or do you think they need to be reformed, or perhaps some new places need to be? Where is this discussion going to be best held, in your opinion?
Well, the closest thing we have to a global government is the United Nations, all right? United Nations has all the countries of the world in it. Within the United Nations, there are many different fora. It could be under the Secretary General. He could decide to do this. But if the technologies being advanced are explicitly being advanced to deal with the problem of climate change, then the UN Framework Convention is the place that ought to be discussed. I don't see why it needs a separate fora to deal with it. It could, if it's to do with food, then you could certainly look at the FAO as another place to talk about it. But if it's explicitly being advanced to tackle climate change, then I think the Framework Convention is the place to bring it up and have discussions around it. And the Framework Convention now is well over 25 years old. We've had many controversial topics brought up. Countries have felt strongly for or against. I'll give you one example that I work on, is the whole issue of loss and damage from climate change. Is a highly controversial topic. Many rich countries, including the United States and UK, don't like talking about it because they feel it's to do with liability and compensation. And so we have arguments. We don't agree on everything, but it is the place to discuss these things. We have to come to an agreement on what we want to do going forward. And so for a small group of countries or even individuals to bypass that decision-making system, in my view, would be highly controversial and absolutely unacceptable in my view.
So right now, to be able to discuss and be part of decision-making, you need to know about something that's happening and have a certain level of knowledge. You've certainly expressed an openness, as you described it, to learning more about some of these new solar radiation modification approaches. Do you see that interest and openness shared amongst people you work with in the least developed countries or in your region, or do you think there's still a bit of reluctance to even start talking and learning about these ideas?
Well, there is I would say, suspicion. All right. And my attitude is, and I'm doing this in Bangladesh with my center here, but also across the least developed countries through a network of universities that my center runs, called the Least Developed Countries Universities Consortium on Climate Change. And we, at the moment, are about 15 universities in 15 LDCs. We're planning to expand to the whole network of 48 least developed countries. But we have been charged, and this is an official group of the least developed countries group, which currently is chaired by Bhutan. And we have been charged by our chair to learn about this topic and advise the least developed countries group about what we feel the attitude should be. And so we are very much in a learning mode. All my colleagues across the LDCs are very interested in learning more, and we've been having conversations with C2G on how we might increase our knowledge. And then based on what we understand, we would then be in a better position to advise our respective governments when the question of government involvement or government advice or government views are come to the fore. But I would say the level of awareness is very low. To the extent that anybody has heard about these things, they will be suspicious of them. And our role is to be a knowledge-based broker to enhance informed judgments. They may end up being negative, but they would be hopefully informed and a basis for being negative rather than just pure suspicion.
So right now, as you sort of begin this process of learning and sharing knowledge, do you see any evidence that perhaps powerful governments, vested interests, civil society organizations in the global north are already beginning to frame this conversation almost before the global south is ready to enter it? Do you see evidence that some organizations may be purporting to speak on behalf of the vulnerable, while the vulnerable are still waiting to learn more? I'm trying to get a sense of where we are in the dynamics of framing this, because once a conversation is framed, it can be hard to unframe it. And now's the moment when this is being framed.
Sure. So I'm aware of the controversy in the north. It's not in the south; it's in the north. And so as I said, sitting in the south and working with the least developed countries constituency in particular, we are still in an open-minded learning mode. And we're willing to listen to you. We're willing to listen to proponents of the technology, and we're willing to listen to opponents of the technology. In fact, in the Gobeshona Conference that I ran last month, we gave the floor, a session to the opponents as well. So we are open-minded. We are listening to everybody. But as I said, we want to learn. A genuine enhancement of knowledge. And if we feel uncomfortable about something, then we'll be very specific about what we are uncomfortable about and why we are uncomfortable about it, rather than just paint everybody with a bad, brush that we disagree with everything.
I've been reading a book called Ministry of the Future. I don't know if you've heard of this book by a science fiction author, Kim Stanley Robinson. He's quite popular. Anyway, within it, he posits a scenario, and it's one of the first books I've seen, which is why I'm raising it, positing this kind of scenario where India conducts a solar, deploys one aspect of this. I'm wondering, and it was just interesting how he came to the decision to make that sort of thought experiment. But I'm wondering if you see any specific political, economic, philosophical, cultural perspectives that your home region of South Asia might bring to discussions around, essentially what for some is a very fundamental question. Can the world pull levers to change the one atmosphere we all share? Do you see any particular traditions or perspective being brought to bear on this from your region?
Well, I would. The one thing that comes to my mind is not necessarily my region specifically, but it is for a number of regions and a number of large countries, is the practice, which is actually a practice of seeding clouds. This is a much more localized phenomenon of enhancing rainfall in one place by human intervention in order to, let us say, a drought-stricken area to get some rain. So done again with the best of intention, but then with the consequence that somewhere else, which was going to get that rain, is deprived of that rain. And we do that. That happens. It is a technology that is utilized and deployed in a number of places. Again, as I said, every solution to one problem creates a problem number two. And often problem number two is different group of people than the problem number one is solving the problem for. So it is very important to understand who's in group one and who's in group two. And what we are very afraid of is being in group two, who are the unintended disbeneficiaries of interventions made for some and not for all. And it's very, very difficult to make interventions that are uniformly equal for all. There's almost always a focus on some and not all. And who that some is what really counts. And that's a universal phenomena. Anything that's done is always focusing on some people and very seldom on all people.
So perhaps in that vein, do you see decisions about SRM approaches being made within the field of science, as it were, informing policy, or do you think it's more fundamentally within the field of power relations, potentially other considerations, including religious or so forth? What do you see as driving these discussions primarily?
I think they should quite rightly be, the decisions to deploy should be in the political governance space. And since these are global issues, they should be in the global political governance, which, as I said, we don't have a single global government, but we have the United Nations. So that's where that decision make. But then there's also a moral element to it. And the moral leaders of the different religions have a say, should weigh it, should be knowledgeable. But I see the role of science as the ones that present these options to the rest of us. It's very similar to the way the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change operates. So it's a panel of all governments who pull together now. Over the last few decades, the numbers of scientists involved have gone into the many thousands, started with a handful of hundreds, who are tasked with assessing the science and presenting the science to policymakers, and then policymakers make the decisions. And I've been in the IPCC for quite a number of years, as you just mentioned in the introduction, and our prescription was always to give policy relevant information, but not policy prescriptive. So we don't we the scientists tell them what the science says, but we don't tell them what they have to do. We say, if you do X, this is likely to happen. If you do Y, something else is likely to happen. But whether you choose X or Y is up to you. You're the policymakers, you decide. And I would say that is actually a good forum for the proponents of SRM or other kinds of technologies to bring. The IPCC assesses the scientific knowledge. They need to produce the scientific knowledge, publish in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and have those scientific information assessed by the IPCC. And then the IPCC can give recommendations or give its views or its assessment to the politicians, who can then make decisions based on that very credible science, by the way. The IPCC is really the height of credibility in terms of science.
I wonder if I could wrap up, perhaps turning to an idea you introduced at the beginning of planetary emergency. We've just had a conversation, including consideration of an approach which would spray aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect. It says something about the state of the emergency that people, reasonable minds can consider this, whatever they come to at the end in terms of conclusions. How do you, both on a sort of a personal, but also with the people you work with, balance this sense of just extraordinary gravity that we would even be considering such interventions at the same time as sort of maintaining hope? And maybe within that, do you think that the framing of planetary emergency how can it tackle that, both the gravity, but also enough hope to actually take actions that can address this crisis?
Well, I agree, and I fully believe that we are in a planetary emergency, and things are getting worse, not better, unfortunately. That's the reality. On the other hand, I don't give up on hope. I do have hope. And I mentioned a few things earlier in terms of the U.S. coming back in the picture on the UN Framework Convention, the Paris Agreement to bring temperature down to 1.5 degrees. We are now moving in that direction. Haven't reached there yet, but we are moving in the right direction. Countries like China, Europe, America, everybody going on the race to net zero. And to me, all of these are good signs. They're not happening fast enough. They need to be much faster. What I am myself a little bit wary of is the sort of, if you like, new version of deniers becoming doomsayers, saying, it's too late. We need a silver bullet. We didn't do it the way we should have done it, and it's too late. And we need something that is going to magic out of thin air. I am extremely suspicious of that reasoning for doing it. Right? I think the conventional ways of doing things, even though we haven't done enough of them, are the way to do things, and involving everybody on the planet to do what they have to do, rather than thinking of one magician with billions of dollars in his bank account deciding on our behalf that he has a magic bullet and he's going to deploy his magic bullet. That, to me, is the wrong way to think about solving this problem.
Professor Saleemul Huq, thank you so much for being part of C2G Talk. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.